This program is part of American Graduate Let's Make It Happen, a public media initiative to address the dropout crisis, supported by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Wyoming PBS and Wyoming Public Media present Getting to the Core of Common Core, with your host, Wyoming Public Radio's education reporter, Aaron Schrank.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's panel forum on the Common Core State Standards for Education and their implementation here in Wyoming. I'm Aaron Schrank, education reporter for Wyoming Public Media. The goal for the next hour is to dig into the new set of standards for English language arts and mathematics currently being rolled out in schools across Wyoming and around the country. Wyoming adopted the Common Core State Standards in 2012. More than 40 other states have also adopted them. This academic year is the first where students will be tested based on the new standards. In the time since Wyoming adopted the standards, they've become increasingly controversial, with opposition to Common Core coming from across the political spectrum. I should note that 3 of my guests here tonight identify themselves as supporters of the Common Core State Standards. One identifies herself as opposing the standards. Tonight's forum is not a debate, but a conversation. The goal is to discuss what these standards are, to examine some of the concerns surrounding them, as well as some of the misconceptions, and to get some insight into the challenges associated with putting those standards in place in our Wyoming schools. With that said, let me introduce the panelists this evening, starting here with Kathy Vetter. Kathy is president of the Wyoming Education Association, a professional organization for educators with around 6,000 members. She's held that position since 2012. She's also had 30 years teaching experience in Wheatland, Wyoming. 24 of those years were spent in special education, and the final 6 as an instructional facilitator at Wheatland High School. Kathy, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Next, we have Dr. Mark Stock. Mark is an assistant professor of educational leadership here at the College of Education here at the University of Wyoming. Before taking the job here, he was superintendent at Laramie County School District 1, the largest district in the state. The district was also among the first to begin working with the new Common Core standards. Next, Amy Edmonds is a policy analyst with Wyoming Liberty Group, a free market think tank. She served for 6 years in the Wyoming legislature as a Republican representing Laramie County. She also previously worked as the executive director of the Wyoming Association of Public Charter Schools. Amy, thanks. Lastly, please welcome Jane Wingate. Jane is a math teacher at Cheyenne South High School within Laramie County School District 1. She's a national board certified teacher and the recipient of the Presidential Award for Excellence in Mathematics and Science Teaching. Jane was on the Standards Review Committee that adopted the Common Core State Standards in Wyoming, and she has worked as a statewide trainer assisting teachers across Wyoming with implementation of the Common Core Standards. Jane, thanks. First, let's talk about what the standards are and how they were formed. As I've mentioned, the Common Core Standards are math and English benchmarks describing what students should know after completing each grade. They were developed by a group of educators from around the country. That group was convened by the National Governors Association. That's a bipartisan organization of the country's governors. And the initiative was also sponsored by the Council of Chief State School Officers, which is an organization made up of education officials. They were released in 2010 for individual states to adopt. The idea behind Common Core is to create a new, more rigorous set of standards that's consistent across the states with the goal of better preparing students for college and careers. Now, you've all been a part of implementation or of the conversation about the Common Core State Standards since the beginning. I want to ask, when the standards were first introduced, how were they received here in Wyoming? Has there been a shift in attitude since? And I'll start with Jane Wingate, who was on the committee to adopt the standards in Wyoming. Jane, what was the initial response?
The process for adopting the Common Core in Wyoming began in early 2010 when a group of educators, parents, stakeholders from across the state were gathered together in Casper, Wyoming in May to revise the Wyoming state standards. And at the time, the Common Core had been released and it was out there, but by no means did we go into that meeting with the intention of adopting the Common Core. Over the process of the time that we spent together, as we looked at the Wyoming state standards and talked about different options and reviewed the Common Core, we very quickly came to the decision that was the direction we wanted to go. We had wonderful conversation, wonderful debate, really pulled the standards apart and looked at what they meant and what we thought about them for Wyoming and how they met with the current Wyoming state standards, what changes it would implement, and we all felt very, very positive about moving in that direction. We met again that October to continue to revise our proposal, and we're on our way towards what we thought was easy adoption by the state of Wyoming. I know at that point we went back to Laramie County School District 1. We're excited and anxious for what we really believe was the right thing to do for our students, for your children. And started moving forward with a very proactive plan, looking at how we could implement and make it be a very positive. So it started very, very positive and very strong.
Great. Amy Edmonds of the Wyoming Liberty Group, how would you characterize the initial response to the Common Core State Standards Initiative, and briefly how have things changed as people have become more familiar with Common Core?
Well, I think the original, as she's spoken to, the original process was it wasn't as broad. It was much more insular. I was in the legislature in 2010, and I can assure you that I had absolutely no idea that the state was looking at new standards or reviewing standards. And across the board, I think all of my colleagues would say the same thing. Not because it was a secret, because it simply wasn't on the radar. And the way that Wyoming sets standards is a very interesting process, one that I have called, and we have at the Wyoming Liberty Group have called broken. It is a broken process that doesn't really work because it's an odd mixture. In 2010, the state board receives a set of standards that the review committees have gone through. They then have to actually vote to adopt those standards to look at, and then they spend 2 more years. So there's 2 votes. There was a vote in 2010 and a vote in 2012. It was that second vote in 2012 where I became aware through constituent correspondence that there was this set of standards and there was a controversy around the standards. So actually in some of the state board minutes, myself and Representative Bob Brechtel showed up at one of the state board meetings and urged the state board to spend more time going out to the public and letting folks know. Because quite frankly, parents just did not know. And now, having done the work that I've done since then, talking to parents all over the state, they didn't know. When you look at the process by which the Wyoming Department of Education tried to inform communities by sending out a superintendent's memo to the superintendents, and they did send a press release, but when you go pull the papers in our communities, they didn't run the press release. Local newspapers did not put the meetings in the paper, so parents just had no idea. And I hear that again and again.
There's certainly some misconceptions about what the Common Core state standards are and what they do. We hope to clear up some of those tonight as best we can. One thing some people don't understand that seems important is the difference between standards and curriculum. Kathy Vetter of the Wyoming Education Association, can you explain the difference between the two?
Certainly, thank you. We look at Common Core or any set of standards as what knowledge our students need to master at each grade level in each subject area. The Common Core just looks at those 2 subject areas, but we have standards in every subject area. Those are set by the state. That's the minimum knowledge our students need to have at each grade level. Then at the local school district level, we set the curriculum. And think of that as the roadmap that school district has chosen in order for their students to meet that set of standards. So you've got your school district setting that roadmap. These are the steps we're going to take at each grade level in order to ensure that our students meet those standards. And then it goes down to the building level and the classroom teacher level where we choose our materials and we set our lesson plans on how we are going to go about following the roadmap that was set by our school district.
Mark Stock, anything to add to help people understand what standards are compared to curriculum and maybe why that distinction is important?
Well, I think it's very important, and one of the reasons is most of the criticisms that have come to my desk as superintendent of schools have not involved the standards. Most of them are involving the materials or the lessons that are being used. So let's look at an industry. All industries of inequality have standards. Whether we're looking at construction industry, there's broad standards. Yet, if you were to build a home in Florida and Maine and Yuma, Arizona, you're going to find the same sets of standards perhaps used, but very radically different houses. So why is that? Well, local control. So using Kathy's analogy, if you have the standards that are laid out, then you have the curriculum, which you use the term roadmap. I would say in a construction analogy, it's the blueprint. It's the design for how we're going to deliver the standard. Well, then once you have the design, you have to go out and purchase materials. You have to have wood or steel or whatever you're going to use. And you go out and find those materials, and all across America, school districts yearly go out and look for materials so they can implement the design of the curriculum. Then, of course, you've got the activities and the lesson plans that the teachers actually do, which is kind of similar to a construction manager who's organizing who's going to do the electrical first, and then we're going to do the plumbing, et cetera. But I guess I want to point out that all of the criticisms that have come to my desk have involved a lesson plan or a textbook or a piece of material with something that was brought in that there's a complaint about. And in reality, that's a local decision. That's not the problem with the standard. That was a problem with whatever someone chose to use. And there's appeal processes in most districts for protesting something that they believe to be out of line. So that would be my analogy to explain the difference between those.
Got it. Kathy Vetter, any other misconceptions about Common Core and where it came from that you see worth noting?
I think the biggest misconception is standards, curriculum, who sets which, and also the fact that we've had standards forever. This isn't something new. My 30 years of teaching, every year there were standards. And so the misconception that this is a brand new idea that we're going to set standards for students is a misconception.
Certainly. I guess one thing that possibly could be a misconception that some bring up is the federalization issue, the idea of whether this is coming from the states or the feds. I guess, Mark Stock, anything to say in that regard?
Well, that's clearly the controversy, is how much involvement should there be. Ironically enough, most of the countries that are quoted as doing better than us in all the assessments, almost all of them have some form of not just national standards, they'll have national curriculum, and some have national materials. That would never fly in America with our emphasis, but I personally, from my point of view, do not see a problem with national standards. I might have a problem with a national curriculum. I think the locals ought to be able to decide how best to teach reading comprehension with which book, which set of materials. So, yeah, then that is the issue, Aaron, is the whole idea of federalization versus local control and how much is which. And unfortunately, even for superintendents, those decisions are largely above our pay grade. I mean, those are political issues that are country-based and nationally-based.
Certainly, and so it's important to note that while the standards were not developed by the Department of Education, the federal government has certainly encouraged the use of the standards. Amy, I wonder if you could speak to that and tell me how that's occurred.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've seen standards reform at the federal level for many, many years. It goes all the way back, I think, originally to President Clinton's Goals 2000s and moving forward. So this is not something new. And as Kathy said, it's not new for teachers to see standards. What is new is this whole system of standards and high-stakes testing and assessment and what that's doing and driving in public education and the policy directives that are moving everybody in that direction. So I don't like to oversimplify the discussion about the Common Core by saying, hey, they're standards and they're not curriculum, because this is really about education policy and what's happening. You know, Clinton with Goals 2000, all the way to President Bush's No Child Left Behind, which was really the really first solidification of this idea of standards. States are going to set standards, we're going to test. Well, we're 14 years into No Child Left Behind, and all of the great promises that we saw under No Child Left Behind, like we're seeing with Common Core, have not come to fruition.
Sure. Can you speak to how the federal government has incentivized states to adopt Common Core?
Absolutely. Basically from the American Competes Act from 2007 all the way to the ARA, which is the stimulus dollars to Race to the Top, the federal government under President Bush and under President Obama have set a reform, one of the reform efforts. So if you look at all of the federal dollars that Governor Freudenthal signed, the documents with state promises, Wyoming promised to increase our college and career readiness standards, to basically create standards that were college and career ready. That was going on way back in 2009. Wyoming was making promises that we were going to increase or create college and career ready standards. Now, this was a new concept for states because college and career ready standards was not something we understood as the state. States didn't have that. The federal government has now defined what college and career ready is, both under the ESEA waiver, under Race to the Top, under the state fiscal stabilization funds, the ARA dollars that we accepted $67 million of back in 2010. And what that is essentially two things. We either can adopt a set of standards that have been adopted by a preponderance of states, that is the Common Core, or we can go to this institution, the University of Wyoming, and our community colleges and create a set of standards that the University of Wyoming and the community college certify will allow that students will not be remediated should they complete these standards.
College career ready standards. Right?
That's the definition. So that's those are the choices that states were faced with all the way back in 2010. This is why Governor Freudenthal and Superintendent McBride were very quick to look at the Common Core and say, hey, let's do it. Because it is very politically unpopular to come to this campus and to go to our community colleges and ask them to certify and stamp off and say these are a great set of standards, and we will not remediate your students should they study under these standards.
Let's talk about what these standards actually look like on paper. Jane, can you provide an example of a standard just to show people exactly what we're talking about here?
Absolutely. I promise I won't give you a test on it when we're done. So an example of a standard, and there's many, but so I'm just going to read one here that jumped out at me. It's under the interpreting functions subcategory, and it says, calculate and interpret average rate of change of a function, presented symbolically or as a table over a specified interval. Estimate the rate of change from a graph.
Amy, I think you also brought some examples with you as well. Any particular standard you can share with us just to show the breadth of what we're talking about, or perhaps a standard you find problematic?
Well, Aaron, I think what you and I talked about on the phone and what I have discussed and talked a lot about is that there's a lot of concern if you go look at old standards, and if you study the standards reform movement and you look at standards that states like Wyoming and all the other states have had in the past versus the Common Core, what you see is the Common Core is very different. If you compare our old 2008 standards to these standards, they're very different. And there is pedagogy in these standards that we did not see in the old standards. So just to give you an example, operations and algebraic thinking. So use multiplication and division within 100 to solve word problems in situations involving equal groups, arrays, and measurement quantities by using drawings and equations with symbols for the unknown number to represent the problem. There is then a footnote. In the footnote, you're going to go to the glossary to Table 2, and in Table 2, you're actually going to get word problems to help you basically create word problems. We've had people like Dr. James Milgram, who's a Stanford math professor, who's gone through, he was hired by the state of Indiana to actually walk through all the math standards. He was hired as an expert to just walk through them and give them an idea of what's good, what's bad. Throughout those documents, you will see him constantly saying, this is not a standard, this is pedagogy. This should be removed if you are looking for just standards. I think these are the things that trouble folks, that these are not just standards.
Sure. My next question is for Jane. Broadly, and this kind of follows up on that, how would you explain the shift going on here in terms of what we're asking, how we're asking students to think and to learn? I've heard some supporters, particularly of the Common Core, describe the standards as sort of shifting away from rote memorization and towards conceptual thinking. I guess, is this accurate, or how would you describe the shift broadly, at least as a math teacher?
Absolutely. What I was originally drawn to on the standards of the Common Core standards for mathematics was that there's two equal sets of standards. There's the content standards, which I read from. They're very dry. You can just read through them. And then there's the standards for math practice. The standards for math practice are 8 standards that describe the levels of expertise that a student would have should have to think as a mathematician, to be able to have critical thinking. And I agree with what Amy said to a point that there is some pedagogy implied, but definitely not dictated. What it implies is that we want our children to understand what they're learning. So we want them to walk out of class understanding so they can apply it in the world around them. Because I don't know about you guys, but it's not very often when I'm walking down the street and somebody asks me to factor a polynomial. I keep waiting because I'm so ready for it to happen. I'm there, but it just hasn't happened. And as a math teacher, I face my students every day, and I look at them when they ask me in seriousness, when am I going to use this? And I have to smile and pretend not to lie and come up with things. But the reality is, if they're learning beyond factoring a polynomial, and they understand why do you do it? In what situations do you do it? How can I take a problem that looks a little different, and how can I make it apply to this? And that's what the standards of math practice are encouraging, us to produce thinkers, not just people that do rote math skills, because that's why we all make mistakes. That's why we forget a formula. That's why we put a plus sign instead of a minus sign, because it doesn't mean anything. So is conceptual understanding the only way to go? Absolutely not. It's a balance. And the word you'll hear me say over and over, it's all about balance. We have to keep that balance and keep a little bit of everything that's right, find that blend of what's right. So to me, that's where the Common Core standards has something new, is it starts to address those issues that we have to create thinkers. We have to create thinkers that are going to be competitive in our global world.
Mark Stock, what would you point to as evidence, you support the standards, what would you point to as evidence that these standards are necessary? And with that, Laramie County School District 1 was one of the first to begin working with them. Why?
Well, one of the first things that our district did was we sat down and looked at the standards that Wyoming had in place, and we looked at some independent studies that did a crosswalk of the Common Core versus what we were using in Laramie 1. And it was universally understood by our staff that the new standards were a lot more rigorous. And based on really that alone, I mean, we weren't aware of political issues, we weren't aware of popularity or those kinds of things. We weren't aware that most of the concerns being brought forth do involve mathematics, Jane. A lot of the examples people are bringing. You know, most of our parents were raised when it comes to division learning the Gazinta method, right? 4 Gazinta 8. 2 times, you know. So that's what they know, okay? They know the Gazinta method. Their kid comes home with a math problem that's got 12 steps to it. It tries to conceptually get at what's actually happening under the hood when you do division, and the parents are confused. And they show their children their method that they learned, and the kids get the right problem, and they take it to school, and maybe they don't get credit because they didn't go through the conceptual steps. That's what I've seen. But our district, we did adopt it even prior to the state board. Discussion started in our district in 2009 and 10, and we did sit down. And our teachers used it as a framework. So our teachers sat through the summer and they would lay out the Common Core standards, they would lay out the Wyoming standards, they lay out their materials, their textbooks, all the things they brought to the table, including their experience. And we wrote our own curriculum, which, as Kathy said, is the roadmap, or in my example, the design, the blueprint. And we developed those for all our subject areas, and we did use the Common Core. At no point in time am I aware of our staff having controversy over that. And a lot of the examples that are being brought forward to me for materials that they're saying, vendors went and put stickers on them that say Common Core aligned because at that time they thought it was a good marketing scheme. They're probably wondering now how smart that was. I'm expecting a new sticker that says anti-Common Core aligned on top of the old sticker, and then we'll be off and selling more books. But the point is that some of those examples were around long before Common Core came in. But anyway, our district did implement it. I think Amy's exactly right. The assessments are part of the problem we're running into here, is that sort of standardization of the assessments.
Sure. Kathy Vetter, do you see a clear need for increased standards? I guess, is unevenness of standards across the states been a problem? And maybe you could speak specifically to what teachers have thought and wanted in that regard.
Well, our population in Wyoming is kind of transient. We have mineral industry, so we have students coming in from across the nation because their parents are moving here because we've got jobs when there weren't jobs other places. And so they're moving in, and if our standards are not aligned with what they were learning in another state, if we expect more or we expect less, those students come in at a disadvantage, a double disadvantage, because number one, they're changing schools. They don't know anyone. And now they're expected to learn something totally different than what they were learning in their previous school. And so it does put students at a disadvantage. The other reason we need higher standards is we want the best for every student in Wyoming. We want them to graduate and be able to compete with students not just from Wyoming, not just from the United States, but internationally. Because this generation of students that is graduating from our high schools aren't going to stay in one job or one state. They're going to be moving around looking, what's my next job? What am I going to do? So they need to know how to think, not just how to memorize. And these higher standards give them that opportunity.
Certainly. Now I'd like to move on to kind of another conversation looking specifically at concerns and moving through. Now, as we've already mentioned, there's certainly a lot of opposition to the Common Core state standards. A recent Gallup poll says almost 2/3 of Americans hadn't heard of the Common Core standards until last year. Now 60% say they oppose the standards. Here in Wyoming, a bill to repeal the Common Core was proposed in last winter's legislative session, but it didn't get enough votes. We've seen similar legislation introduced around the country, in 10 other states. All of the candidates who ran for state superintendent of public instruction here in Wyoming at least raised concerns about the standards on the campaign trail. National survey results also make clear that Common Core is a tainted brand name. I would say much like Obamacare, for example, in some cases. In some cases, these surveys show people oppose the label, but not necessarily the basic concept to which it's attached. But it's clear that there's a lot of pushback against these standards and many arguments against them. So I'd like to work through some of those right now. And maybe first, a good way to start, Let me start by asking you simply, what is your biggest concern about the Common Core state standards in Wyoming? I'll start with Amy.
I'm not going to be able to hit one. I'm going to
Sure.
hit a couple. What I would say, first of all, is that, again, the standards are a part of an entire system that's being brought down that we see, not just the standards. So as Dr. Stock mentioned, assessment as well. This is a whole system, and we've seen this in the standards reform movement. So when Dr. Stock referenced that countries that have a centralized, nationalized standard score better than us, we also have to reference that countries that have decentralized systems score better than us. So standards are not the silver bullet. If we're just looking internationally, there is no actual data to show that centralization of standards or uniformity in standards across the country result in higher performance. As I said, what is the definition of insanity? No Child Left Behind was the first attempt to unify states and say, you're going to set high standards, we're going to test the heck out of you, and students are going to grow. We are 14 years into it, and we have not seen those results. Here we are again with something that, we heard on the floor of the Wyoming House of Representatives, a representative from the western part of the state say, this is a grand experiment. That is exactly what this is. And yet we are being promised all of these wonderful things that this is going to bring scores up. The Brookings Institute just came out with a new study. You have to realize there are states that are far ahead of the state of Wyoming who've had the Common Core for over 5 years, and they are now studying the NAEP tests, the results of those states and how are they doing. It's very clear. Their scores have gone up 3 points. 3 points. If you think about the kind of money, the effort, what districts in those states have been doing, all the teacher learning that's gone on to bring down the Common Core, and yet we're not seeing the promised results in the states that are ahead of Wyoming. And Wyoming is rushing forward to implement these standards. The definition of sanity is doing the same thing twice and expecting different results. This whole push that standards is going to be the silver bullet is simply not going to happen. We can all promise to come back here in 12 years, just like, in 2003 and 4, there were debates about No Child Left Behind, with the proponents of No Child Left Behind saying how wonderful we're going to see. It didn't happen. Nobody ever looks in the rearview mirror and holds people accountable for making all of these promises. I can guarantee you we can all come back here in 12 years, Aaron, and we're not going to see the results.
Jane, briefly, your biggest concern? Briefly, if you could.
My biggest, and I'm going to apologize for being a little personal on this one, but as the person who sees these children every day, my concern is that we've made something very political into something that is about our kids and shouldn't be. And we all have the same intentions. And I want to talk about the real issues. I want to be a part of the solution. I don't want to keep talking about the problem. And this set of standards is not the problem. We do have other problems, assessment and the other package, but it's not the standards. I want to separate that. Let's accept the standards, and let's talk about what's really going to matter.
Mark Stock, your biggest concern?
Well, I would start out by saying that the standards are not the problem. Education is such a messy business. There are so many factors that involve education, from the family to the home to the issues. All of these things have some kind of an imprint on the whole system. Standards, having a standard isn't the problem. And, an example of a standard, and I had a parent come up to me at one of our forums on Common Core in Laramie County and say, I'm opting out of Common Core. Here's my signature on the form. I'm opting out. My child will not have any Common Core activities in the classroom. And I said, well, what grade's your child in? She said 4th. And I said, well, let me read you a 4th grade language arts standard, and you tell me how to opt out. It says, by the end of the year, read and comprehend literature, including stories, dramas, and poetry in the grades 4 to 5 text complexity band. And I said, that's a standard. Now, admittedly, I picked one that's easy to understand and non-controversial, right? But how could I teach 4th grade reading and not teach them to read and comprehend a story? I said, I can't opt out of that. I don't understand how I could. These standards are written so generally broadly, in most cases, at least the language arts, and Jane, I'm no mathematician, so I'm not even going to, I was hoping you'd pick a 3rd grade example. But, the issue here is I don't think that, from my point, the concern I have is that we've politicized it. And so let's say, what are we going to do now? We're going to walk, my district has spent 4 years on its own, local control, doing our own thing because we felt like this was better than what we were doing before. Now, if we don't do that, what will we do? Some of the states that have opted out, like Indiana, are now getting criticized. That's where I taught for many years, or was superintendent, and I followed them. And Indiana did one of the first states to opt out, and then they redid their own standards, and now they're being criticized because they claim they've just repackaged the old standards with a new name and a new brand name, as you put it, Aaron. And so I guess if we're going to use this example, I don't think you could write any set of standards that didn't include a reading standard to read and comprehend at the grade level. So that would be my position on it. I think my concern is, where do we go from here? I don't want to back up. Our teachers we've done better. The metrics that we collect in Laramie 1 in most areas and almost everything we've done over those 4 years, and I think some of it is attributable to that.
Sure. Kathy, if you don't mind, I'm going to move on to the next question, just because there's a lot of specific concerns, we need to get to. One thing we should probably touch on, because at least from my perspective, it seems to be sort of the broadest criticism or fear about the standards, and we sort of touched on it when talking about the federalization concern earlier, but this one-size-fits-all idea. I guess, again, to Mark, what do you make of that concern? Is Common Core too prescriptive, or does it limit teachers' flexibility?
Not at all. The tighter you are about the standard, the more flexibility you have on how to deliver it. In districts where they're mandating materials and scripting lessons, then yes, that isn't a problem with the standard. That's a problem in how administration or staff decided to implement a standard. But the real issue there is that the standard isn't the driving problem there in that case.
Amy, what do you think? Is it possible? Can states have uniform sets of standards but still have diversity in education? Why or why not?
I think it's a very premature question to ask in Wyoming.
Sure.
I mean, I think that's the answer you're going to get in Wyoming because we haven't seen assessment attached to the standards yet. So that's the answer you're going to get. If you go look at the states that are assessing, that's not the answer you're going to get. This is ultimately a drive towards uniformity and centralization of education. There's no way around it. Proponents will say that. We want the same set of standards. Everybody wants the same set of standards. What Wyoming has not seen yet, and we're still in the honeymoon phase, is we've not seen the assessment. Wyoming's on the cusp. The legislature has been passing accountability measures. I was in the legislature when they started that work. They're continuing on. We have yet to see them bring the teacher evaluation process, tie it to the test scores. We are in the honeymoon phase. So we have a very honeymoon view of the Common Core right now, and what it ultimately means when we hook it together with the assessment will be a very different answer.
Yeah, there are many concerns that come up related to testing. As I think I mentioned earlier, actually we didn't mention that. Two different groups have been developing assessments that will be used to test the standards. Mark, actually, another question for you. What's in store for Wyoming students in terms of testing this academic year? Will this mean more high-stakes testing for Wyoming students?
Well, I don't see any scenario in which testing seems to decrease as long as we're on this accountability kick. If we're going to try, what's interesting, a lot of the countries that have made major progress have done it through building capacity and training and teaching and helping, not through heavy-handed accountability. But for whatever reason, America is enamored in the educational environment with accountability now, which the underlying assumption is that teachers and administrators must not be doing a good job, because if they were, we wouldn't have this. That's some kind of an underlying assumption that I personally believe is an inadequate response. I've analyzed the PISA test results from 2010, and interestingly enough, America, if you disaggregate by countries of origin, if you look at our Asian Americans, we're number one in the world on the PISA test. The only people that were better than us was Shanghai, which is a city. If you look at our there's 37 predominantly white nations in the world, and the PISA test shows that our white Americans were number 2, right behind Finland, which is always held up as a great example. If you go right down those ethnicity things, you'll find that in terms of countries of origin, we do real well, but what's the difference? We're a melting pot with open borders. Everyone gets a shot here at the American Dream, and we shut no one out. We don't shuttle them off into vocational schools and say you're not capable. These are all things that impact us here in our country that I think make some of these testing issues a little more problematic than just pointing to a test score.
Sure, Kathy. These new standards are higher and tests should be harder. Scores are expected to maybe drop, especially initially as a result. Should students, parents, and particularly teachers be concerned about that?
Well, I think we have to look at how we roll these standards out. Okay, in Laramie 1, when you think about how many years you've been doing these standards, which set of students have had those standards their entire education career? It certainly isn't our high school students. So they're going to have larger gaps because they haven't been taught those prerequisites building up to those standards. So if you really want to look at whether or not the implementation of a standard, of changes in standards are making a difference, it takes 13 years, technically 12 because kindergarten's not required in Wyoming, but if your child goes to kindergarten, it's 13 years before they have been taught the new set of standards. So when we test, we are going to test all those grades, and only some of them have been taught the standards their entire school career. So looking at how they score, yeah, we're kind of in the same boat as other states that implemented at the same time, but not those that are further ahead because they'll have students at higher grades that have had these standards all along.
Moving on to the next question, let's talk about some concerns on the actual substance of the standards. For example, in English language arts, there's a move towards reading more informational texts and less literary ones that has some worried. With the math standards, some are concerned that those for high school math, the standards for high school math, don't go far enough to prepare students for jobs, STEM jobs, jobs in science, technology, engineering, and math. Amy, what are your thoughts there on the math standards?
You know, my concerns and concerns of others who've looked over the standards and have looked at folks who've studied them as well. The STEM career one, I think, is probably the most troubling. We've had the actual authors of the standards themselves, Dr. Jason Zimba, who's a professor on the East Coast, who's one of the 5 authors of the math standards, who's testified numerous times before state legislators on the East Coast, basically say he ultimately admitted that these standards stop at a weak Algebra 2 and that they do not prepare children for a STEM career. I think that is troubling. Wyoming right now, we're not going to see that, and I know I'm not going to hear that from teachers right now because we are still, as I said, in this honeymoon period. We have the old standards, we have an old way of which we teach standards, but if these standards stay in place for 12, 13, 15 years, we could be looking potentially at districts are going to put their money where they know they have to perform and where assessment tells them they have to perform. And so they put all of their energies into that. So when we continue to couple standards with high-stakes testing and all that they're going to be tested on is a weak Algebra 2, most districts are going to stay right there and aren't going to go beyond that. That, I think, it troubles a lot of folks. I mean, that's something to be concerned about. And it is the coupling of the standard and the testing.
Jane, you teach math at the high school level. What do you think about what's expected of 12th graders under these standards? And explain it to me. I mean, obviously, the standards are a baseline. Would there be room for differentiation under the standards so 12th graders could take calculus and you know?
Well, I should add a little background that my degree is in electrical engineering from the University of Wyoming, and I'm a second career math teacher. So STEM is something that's very close to my heart. And I tell all my students they can be any type of engineer they want to be. They can pick. The Common Core standards are exactly what Kathy said. They're the minimum standards that every child needs to meet. Now, I also teach an algebra concepts class, which is the lowest course that we teach. I have 3 ELL students in my class right now that do not speak English. And I have those 2 classes back to back, I might add. So, you know, that idea of that we can't get to the top, oh yeah, we can. Absolutely we can, because I do it every day. The Common Core has what's called plus standards. They are not assessed. They are the standards that go beyond into a pre-calc. So these standards are meant for a junior because that's where we test, we assess at the 11th grade. So this is the minimum requirements that every junior, that little boy that sits in my algebra class that doesn't speak English, this is what we expect him to do. And you know what, that's what I expect him to do. The next period, I have BC calculus students that are doing Calc 2, second semester college calculus. And this isn't preventing me from teaching them. It's not preventing me from sending lots of children over the hill to Laramie to be engineers.
Aaron?
Yes, go ahead.
I just want to say one thing, just to add a point that I think is fairly important. And I understand her point, and I respect it very much so. But what I would say is that when we look at these standards, and we look at, again, tying them to assessment, I think we have to be troubled because this is real education policy that Wyoming has yet to see completely unfold. But it is where we're heading. This is where we're going with assessment and with the standards. So it's a reality that's going to come to bear on this state, and we are in the honeymoon phase. The other point I want to make is the Common Core standards are not the highest set of math standards in this country. So when we talk about reaching high, I want us to reach high too. And when we talk about solutions, I would love for us to spend some time this evening talking about solutions. There are higher math standards than the Common Core.
California, for example.
California, for example. Why did Wyoming not look at those standards? If we want to talk about excellence, we could have gone higher. We chose not to. Let's go higher. Let's really go higher and have teachers, excellent teachers like the one beside me, teach students with exceptional standards.
Sure. I'd like to move on to the next question. There's also a sense that this big change to public education it happened with too little public input and with too small a group of people behind it. And it's worth noting that much of the Common Core initiative was bankrolled by Bill Gates through his Gates Foundation. He spent more than $200 million pushing the standards. I guess I'm wondering, is that problematic, the degree to which big business is involved here? Should that impact my view of the standards? Amy, what do you think?
Oh my.
Just say yes.
Big question.
Yeah, it's a big question. I'm an ardent capitalist, so I have no problem with folks achieving the American dream and making money. But there is no doubt that there is money to be made in the public education business. And I think we should be troubled and we should watch what's happening there. So, yeah. Dr. Stock, yes.
Mark, you have a thought?
Well, I was just going to say, this might be the thing where the right and left political views agree. This is the point where they kind of come around full circle and agree. I think there is some concern, clearly a lot of, if you want to call them lobbyists, people that were close to the testing industry were helpful in doing all this. And what's their golden egg in all this? They have a lot at stake as to winning the assessment battles and getting the contracts to actually sell the tests. So I think this is an example where maybe there's a room for a lot of folks to be concerned about. But I would add this. Is there ever been a point in American history where there's been massive grassroots level involvement in writing standards for education? That's largely been left to educators and nobody cares. And so we're in our little sweatshops writing standards. That's what we do. That's our jobs. But there hasn't been any point in history where there's been a massive grassroots level effort to actually write standards.
It's also worth noting that as Common Core has lost support in the last year, recent polls show that's been especially true among teachers. Kathy Vetter, support for Common Core among teachers went from 76% last year to 46% this year. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with implementation and accountability, as Amy has spoke about. When you're holding an educator accountable for your 11th grader having met the standards when they've only been in place 3 years. As I said earlier, they haven't been taught all the standards. That's one of the reasons. Another reason is they've moved really quickly in a lot of states, and they didn't have time to develop their lesson plans, their curriculum, and they didn't have time to learn themselves what those standards are and what would be the best way to help their students achieve those standards. So it isn't the standard itself. Once again, the higher standards isn't what the educators are frustrated with. It's being held accountable for students who haven't had the opportunity to learn them and not having the time to develop those great lesson plans to ensure that every student, if they speak English, if they speak a foreign language, no matter what, all of them can learn.
Great. Now let's spend the remainder of our time here talking about implementation of the Common Core here in Wyoming and the successes and challenges associated with that process. As we've mentioned, some districts have already gone pretty deep into the Common Core standards, Laramie County one among them. Mark Stock, what's your impression of what implementation looks like across Wyoming? Does it speak a bit more about that? Does it vary wildly on a district-by-district basis?
It does vary, Aaron, and that a lot of it depends on whether or not districts that had capacity, like Laramie 1 with its size and its ability, capacity-wise, has curriculum coordinators for each subject, and they were able to get enough teachers together and get started earlier. In very small districts where there's a lot of teachers teaching multiple courses and lots of things to, multitask, and they didn't have a person in charge of curriculum, whose sole job was to manage that process. So yes, it's been uneven across Wyoming, but we're here and the state board had adopted it, and I know our board president says whether you like it or don't like it, state board's approved it, we're moving ahead until somebody tells us differently. But it has been, I would call it an uneven implementation across Wyoming.
Kathy Vetter, would you say are teachers getting enough professional development with Common Core?
That also varies with our school districts. Our large school districts, such as Laramie 1, have the capacity to do the professional development. Our smaller districts, it's really difficult for a small district where you've got a teacher who teaches 2 subject areas, different prep every single hour, to get enough professional development on 2 different sets of standards in this short period of time, or teaching at the elementary level 2 to 3 grades. So it really varies according to the capacity of our school district.
Sure. Jane, you've been in that role at training teachers on the Common Core. Tell us what that professional development looks like. How involved is it?
When we began the training for Common Core around the state under the Department of Education, we originally developed 4 modules to help, and the module 1 was just an awareness. And so I had the opportunity to go around the state and visit with so many teachers and help them really dig into the standards, and we, just become aware of them. Unfortunately, before we ever got a chance to do module 2, 3, or 4, the program was canceled. So we had a lot of great stuff planned, and I had a lot of wonderful opportunity. I learned a lot, and we shared. It was really that grassroots opportunity, but unfortunately, we didn't get to follow it through.
Jane, what would you say are the biggest challenges associated with implementation? What are you hearing, particularly from educators around the state?
Absolutely. Because the standards are a little more rigorous, and in many situations, standards that we had before, there's not that much new. Math, there's not that much new. But things are moved around a little bit in different grade levels. So it's exactly what Kathy said is the gaps. But what we've done is everything possible to not have gaps. Because you know what? There are kids. We don't want them to have gaps. And a little gap here and a little gap here and a little gap here. Next thing you know, it becomes a big gap. So that's been our challenge, is to figure out how to teach what we need to on grade level without missing anything. And we've done it, but it's been hard.
What about issues with materials, textbooks?
Well, we have one of those that says Common Core on the front cover, because we were up for textbook. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, it's hard because you know what? It became, all of a sudden we had these national standards. It was this, there were not national standards. We had standards that many people were adopting, and it became a business. And why wouldn't you try to sell textbooks? So sorting through what's really quality curriculum and what's the same thing in a different cover is a challenge, but it's not a challenge that we didn't have before or wouldn't have otherwise. It's just part of the education system. It's part of the game we play, is looking for those right materials. So now you have to be very careful, because just because it says Common Core, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything at all. What does it really say? What is it all about? You have to look at it critically, just like we're asking our kids to look at things critically.
Amy, do you have concerns about whether there's enough choice in terms of curriculum?
I don't think that's necessarily a Common Core question. From my perspective in the Wyoming Liberty Group, when we talk about choice, obviously we're talking about a broader subject than just curriculum within the Common Core. Again, the troubling aspects of the Common Core and whether or not we are trying to make a uniform system in the public education system is that ultimately we're driving out a lack of diversity and a lack of options for parents. So when you talk to me about choice, it's a much broader question than curriculum within the Common Core.
Certainly. This will be my last question, and I'll ask it to all the panelists. Where do we go from here with the controversy and concerns surrounding the Common Core standards, given where things stand with the rollout? What are the next steps in regards to Common Core in order to best serve Wyoming students? Amy, I'll start with you. Is it back to the drawing board? What's best?
I think ultimately what's best for Wyoming is to remove ourselves from the Common Core, and I don't think that it's reasonable for us to do it overnight. As Dr. Stock has said, and we understand, the WEA understands, districts have spent a lot of time and money on this over the last couple of years. It is politically unpalatable, and I think it has become a real and true issue. But when I say remove ourselves from the Common Core, I think we need to, as she said, we need to have a broader conversation about where we are going with education policy as far as assessment, as far as accountability, and tying all those things together. And instead, the state should be moving towards more diversity in education, giving parents more options, not less, and not tying teachers to assessing, and thinking that somehow we're going to tie teachers and hold them accountable as though they're not doing a good job. We need to free teachers. We need to free the local districts. We need to get out of all of these education schemes. We need to look back at history and realize that the federal government involvement in education has not helped the public education system. From Goals 2000, No Child Left Behind on to the whole Common Core scheme. This is not working. Wyoming needs to take a lead, get out of it, and create a system that we've created here that gives parents more options.
Jane Wingate, your thoughts? How do we move forward? What's next?
I guess for me, it's separating the issues here and recognizing that the Common Core standards are exactly that. They're a list of standards. And let's discuss the other issues. Let's separate the two. And instead of hanging everything on Common Core, because that's what it's become a scapegoat, let's just blame it on Common Core. No, let's not blame it on Common Core. Let's identify the real problems and let's address them. Let's address our graduation rate. Let's get our kids graduated. Let's get them ready for what's next. And let's not blame it on this genuinely innocent piece of paper that's standards. Because the standards themselves don't do anything. It's what we do after that. So that's where I'm at.
Kathy Vetter, your thoughts?
I agree with Jane. We need to separate. We go forward with our standards. We have set standards, the same method that we've used to set all the rest of the standards. Let's continue forward. But let's look at that testing, that over-testing of our students. That's not standards. That's assessment. So I think like Jane said, let's separate those issues. Let's make sure that we address that toxic testing issue where we are over-testing students instead of instructing them. And I think we go forward with our standards and address the real issues.
Mr. Stock?
Well, I think they've said it real well when it comes down to the A word and all, the dirty A word in here is accountability, and I'm not afraid of it, and I don't think we should be. I think education has finally accepted the notion that we must be more accountable. We've got to show the public something that shows how we're doing in a way that's more than just standardized assessments. The danger that Amy's pointing out is real, and that is that the curriculum might look good on paper, but what is being tested is going to be narrowed and narrowed and narrowed and narrowed until we have to work on whatever we're held accountable to. And the thing is the vast majority of what schools do really well in America is never measured. We measure what is cheapest and easiest to measure, and that becomes language and math. That's easy to do, easier, but we don't. Let's talk about the art and the music and the things that make a rich, holistic environment for our kids. We cannot abandon those things, and the fear is that over-testing will narrow that down to where those things are neglected, and then we won't have creative entrepreneurs creating new products, which is what I thought we wanted. So.
Sure, we have a little bit of time for a couple more minutes of conversation. Anything, Amy, that you want to discuss that we haven't had time to get to that we could discuss in a few minutes?
Well, I think ultimately, and Dr. Stock said it very well, this whole assessment, hooking it to the Common Core, and I think it would be good to have deeper conversations. I may use the phrase Common Core. I'm not trying to hook things onto the Common Core. I'm saying that this is a system. Wyoming's in the honeymoon period. We have yet to see what it's going to look like, as Dr. Stock said, and it is going to narrow that focus and narrow that focus. That's the reality of high-stakes testing. It's a reality. I mean, Dr. Stock has been in the position of being a superintendent in a large district and understanding that you're going to be held accountable for those scores. And boy, is that accountability coming. It is coming. Joint Education Accountability is meeting again this month. They will be moving forward. We saw kind of a slow period over this last 2 years, but I have a feeling in 2015 in the legislative session, we will see more accountability legislation moving forward. So we are headed in that direction, and this is going to continue to move Wyoming in a certain direction. I think it's the wrong direction.
Mr. Stock?
One last comment, and I would say that where Wyoming missed the boat, in my opinion, is when the lawsuit was settled and the Wyoming Supreme Court said in the mid-90s that we are going to have an outstanding educational system. When we poured the resources into education, we should have and didn't see down the road far enough to put in some measures of accountability that would have been consistent and stayed the same so we could show how we've done over time. We've been moving a target. PAWS has been a moving target in this state, and our teachers are tired of shooting at things that are flying around and never hitting anything because it changes year after year after year. So we don't have longitudinal data to show that the resources Wyoming poured into did make a difference. I think it has, and I don't know that we can prove it because we haven't had a consistent measurement.
Now we want to give folks a chance, give people in the audience a chance to ask questions of the panel. WPR's Miles Bryan will be walking around with some microphones. I guess if you're somebody that wants to ask a question, either clarifying something you heard one of the panelists say here tonight, or just asking a question about something we didn't get a chance to get to, please raise your hand, and Miles will bring you a microphone. And
if you'd stand up, please, I'm going to try to get a shot at everybody else.
I want to thank the participants in this panel. It was so non-adversarial, and you're all so well informed that I really appreciated this. I do want to ask, I'm a professor of speech pathology, and I have really welcomed the bringing in of the Common Core for English Language Arts. It's helped special educators hook into the classroom and be functional in that way, and we really appreciate being able to go across states and that type of thing. But I want to address the math. I'm not a math teacher. My friend is, and I've been learning a lot about math instruction and the great things that have been happening in that. But what I do want to address is that idea of whether our math standards are high enough coming out of high school. I advise freshman students coming into the University of Wyoming, and I have been shocked, I guess, to say, over the years with how many of my students who come in and say that they got A's in math or that they achieved some level of math course in high school, and they aren't making it on the placement tests and the ACTs. And so what I'm seeing there is a loss of retention. And so I'm not really interested in seeing my high school students purportedly passing higher and higher levels of math. What I want to see is those high school students have a really solid, applied, maintained knowledge of basic algebra so that I can walk them into our basic algebra course instead of having to put them in problem solving or into remedial 900 level math classes. So if the new math instruction, which it appears to me with this conceptual approach really focusing on application, if that can help them with retention of it all the way into their first year of university, I'll be thrilled with that. And so thank you. I don't know if that's a question or comment. I'm looking right at my math teacher over there.
I was just going to say I agree, and I wish I had said it as eloquently as you, because that's, I live that world. I teach seniors who then turn around and have to go back into remedial classes, and they come to me, and I deal with that. I mean, it's personal to me. It's faces, and yeah, it's a problem, and there's so many issues there. There's levels of it's the the transition, and that's a whole nother conversation we can have. But absolutely, it is about retention, and I personally just believe it begins with understanding. Retention begins with understanding.
And I don't want to isolate it. Math is probably our most abstract area, but it isn't just about math. It's just that math is the most easy to put in the placement levels because it's so sequential. And so I find our students have forgotten a lot of what they've learned in language arts, in science, whatever, but it's just math is where we get to see it. So it's kind of the canary in the coal mine for us for retention and use in college.
We're working on it.
I would like to add to that I think one thing we have to remember is where we've come from. I graduated in 1975. I shouldn't have said that, but the requirement was 1 year of mathematics, and you could take arithmetic, not algebra, and get your credit. Today, in Laramie 1, you must have 4 years of mathematics. We have kids, the minimum level is Algebra 2 or Calculus. That's what's happened since 1975. And one of the problems Wyoming has in particular is the fact that most of our seniors have a culture of blowing off their senior year. And they don't take math. They get their credits done in those first 2 or 3 years, and then their senior year, they take it easy. And my own son informed me here that when he was a senior that I'm going to take half the year off, Dad. I think I'm just going to take 2 classes. I said, no, you're not. No, you're not. You're going to take math your senior year because you're going to walk in and take that placement test, and you're going to have been perhaps 18 months since you last took math, and you may bomb that placement. We had a student who was making pretty good grades in a calculus course who didn't pass the remedial class because the stuff that's on the entrance level test, she took in 7th grade. And so she's like a little fuzzy on that easy stuff that went clear back to 7th and 8th grade.
Next question, if you could say your name and ask your question either of the panel or a specific panelist.
Hi, my name is Joy, and I am new to Wyoming, but I have a question essentially for both Kathy and for Jane. So as a STEM educator, it's really important that I see science in service to math and to English. And so my approach to education has always been to provide literary as well as numerical contexts for the science that I teach. And so the question about, or the comment about context and retention, I think sort of advances this notion, because the Common Core itself also provides that in the push to have informational text. So I guess my question then to you as educators, and I guess to Mark as well, and perhaps even to Amy as a community advocate for education, is where then, or how then, do we advance the conversation and decouple assessment from the standard in a culture where teacher evaluation is absolutely on the horizon? And so I say that, again, coming from a state where we have, I've lived in 3 states where we've adopted standards, also adopted teacher evaluation that incorporates standards, and other that don't. And I know the trajectory. And so in service to the Common Core, or in service to English and math, how then do we do this so that teachers have autonomy and feel that they have autonomy without sacrificing all of the things that we all want, which is rigor, relevance, and relationship in the classroom?
Who wants it?
Yeah, sorry.
I think I love all your points. I want to make sure I actually answer your question. So, and I think you asked a big question there. I think, as Dr. Stock said, it's all messy work. It is messy work. You know, I'm blessed to work in a district where we have amazing time for collaboration. And it's a cornerstone of the work we do, because we're not independent contractors anymore, and we can't be that way anymore. Our kids deserve better. So a lot of what you're talking about is accomplished through that collaboration and working together and working cross-curricular. I know we have a big push for content literacy. So what does content literacy look like in mathematics? Because it's going to look different than in an English classroom. And so it is something that, and it's not a mandate, it's something that we're discussing, and we as educators are finding the value in, and we're talking about it with each other. So I think, you know, the best answer I can get is the desire to embrace those ideas, and then the willingness to have those conversations at that grassroots level, teacher to teacher, to start talking about what is that going to look like in our classroom, and how can we best implement that.
And I would say from the policy level, when you asked about decoupling assessment and the standards and how do we have that conversation, that's a policy question. And that's going to happen at the state legislature level, essentially, and also at the federal level. The reality for the state of Wyoming right now, as probably for the states that you came from, is we can't do it. We've accepted federal funds. We are required, we do not have a No Child Left Behind waiver right now, so we are under the mandates of No Child Left Behind, a federal piece of legislation. We have to move forward with teacher evaluation, with assessment, with accountability. We can't uncouple it. And that's the reality. I would like to have a deeper conversation about federal involvement in education and why we shouldn't have federal involvement in education, because the answer is, for all the intentions of great teachers, the state legislature cannot do that.
Great. Do we have another question? The gentleman in the back of the room.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I agree with Amy that the parents need more options. I'm both an educator and a parent. But I don't believe that the standards are what is limiting the options. When we look at Wyoming, Wyoming's a rural state, but it has pretty diverse communities. And so I think the districts themselves are what should be on the hook for creating those options. And I think that it's not fair to the standards to say that the standards are the scapegoat for limited options. So my question to the panelists, all the panelists, are how do local districts provide those options to parents?
Well, I might be unusual, so I can't speak for superintendents as a profession because I support charter schools. I see no problem with competition and choice. It doesn't bother me in the slightest. Now, I'm unusual. That's not maybe something that maybe most educators would argue for, but I think the Wyoming charter law is flawed. If you're talking about choices like that, like what schools should my child go to? Wyoming is so unique. Charters are not going to be competitive in most of our small communities. There's just not enough market. They're not going to make enough money to make a go. So only your larger districts are going to have that. And the current Wyoming charter law puts the onus of that charter under the local school board. So essentially, in my opinion, it's not a charter at all. It's a magnet school like you see in other large urban environments. It's a public school with a philosophy or a particular way of doing things, and your public school students can go there if they want. That's, in my opinion, not an actual competitive charter. But I know that's not popular with the School Boards Association either. They still want to maintain control in Wyoming of whether or not they have a charter in their community. They want that control, not the parent. So I don't know what other options or choices. You're talking about choices. I'm not sure what other kinds of choices you might be wanting other than what school your children go to.
Yeah, and I'm off. Charter is a good reference. How about online options? Do any panelists have any thoughts on online options?
We do now. I mean, we have in Laramie County, I think, there was at least, I know, 150 students who were taking one of the online school options out of Niobrara County or others. So that is an option in Wyoming to get your K-12 license. We stopped signing memorandums of agreement with those schools because when accountability came on, at that time, the student would take their online courses through Niobrara or from Jackson, there's one up there. They would take their curriculum through there, but they were our student and they got a Laramie 1 diploma. So where we quit signing those is because I don't want the accountability for a student I've never seen. If you're going to hold me accountable for my test scores as an administrator, I don't want any students I don't actually influence. So most schools have quit signing those, so they're actually public school students in Niobrara now, or Jackson.
And I was hoping Dr. Stark was going to give that example because that example just explains why choice is being choked out. And the online example is a great example. When you tie that assessment, districts are just not willing to sign off and let these children go onto an online school that they are going to be held accountable for, that they don't have, as I think you said, influence over.
They can still get that education, but the piece of paper doesn't. And we have a lot of parents that for whatever reason really want the Laramie 1 diploma because all their friends are here and they want to walk on the stage at the commencement with their peers, and so they want that paper. But they're not our students, technically.
We have another question on this side of the room.
Yes, I'm Maggie Murdoch, and I'm a professor of political science here. So my one comment that has to come from the social perspective, and that is, of course, this kind of political system demands that we have informed participants. And that's why free public education has been absolutely essential to the success of this political system. Just rereading de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, and he made that point from early in the 19th century. So it's important to us, and I think that's why we're having this conversation, and I agree with Teresa. This has been a wonderful discussion. I have a little bit of a confusion, and maybe it's based also in this question that came from the back from the parent. More choice for parents. I'm not sure what that means. Do I get to choose whether my student reads a certain book in school? I can tell you from my experience in Casper in the 1980s, the parents that objected to certain textbooks, we found out, hadn't read them. They had heard from somebody else that they were bad. So if the parents know what they're talking about, I think that that's really good. I think choice is important in our society. My question has to do with what I heard almost every single panelist say, and that is, well, professional development varies by district, depending upon the resources and the size of the district. Other important educational resources vary by district, depending upon the size and the resources of the district. My question is, why is that okay? Why is it okay that if you live in Gillette, you get a great education, or if you live in Cheyenne, you get a great education, but not in Lingle, for example, or JM or Baggs? I think you can get good education in small towns. I grew up in Wyoming, grew up in Torrington. I was able to compete wherever I went to undergraduate or to graduate school. But why would we say it's okay that it would vary by district for professional development or the resources available to students? Why don't we find some way in the state, if we want the state to make the decision, to make sure that every single student in every single school has the same opportunity for a good education, regardless of how big the district is, regardless of the resources that may come from that particular county? So that's my question.
I think resources, we have centralized our resources. One of the problems is the rural nature. So you have a school that has 45 students, K-12. That's a school in the school district I taught in for 30 years. You're not going to be able to offer AP calculus every year in that school because you may not have any students that are at that level or want that class. So how do you have a math teacher that's sitting and being paid for only teaching certain classes? That's where kind of that inequity comes, because we don't have enough students. You may only have one kid in that grade level. And so online virtual learning for those advanced classes, I think, is one way that we can offer those things for our students in those really small rural school districts that can't have a teacher sitting around waiting until there's a student that wants to take that course. We can't be paying teachers to not teach.
And I'm so glad you came to the second half of that, because I will confess I've spent 12 years of my life as the dean of the outreach school at the University of Wyoming, and distance education is pretty important. I never understood why we didn't share teachers across districts for precisely the reason that you're talking about, because the state spent a lot of money building a system to allow us to do that, and it wasn't well used. And so that's really the question. Why don't we utilize the technologies and the resources that we have already built in order to do precisely what you're talking about? Because I don't think we're doing that now.
The one comment that I would make is just that I want to make sure that we don't confuse, or we're not confusing the conversation we had about professional development of teachers and then ultimate outcomes of students. So in Wyoming, if you take a look, it's actually rather counterintuitive. Our small districts are doing an exceptionally good job as far as graduation rates and test scores. And it's actually our larger districts that are struggling. So there, we have this conversation about inequality in professional development, but that does not translate into result.
Yeah, one of the issues there that's let's start with the equity issue you brought up. Supreme Court settled that. We're not supposed to have that kind of inequity in Wyoming. That was settled in the Camel decision in '95. It should be relatively done. And I will say that Wyoming has funded its schools exceptionally well, and in comparison to other states, our smaller districts, have a lot of resources in comparison. So, but they'll never have the scale that the large districts have. And back to Amy's point, one of the issues, and it ties to the comment made about teacher evaluation and accountability, and that is this state has to address the issue of mobility. I've done the study. Dr. Moore and I conducted our own internal study in Laramie 1, and I can tell you right now that we stripped out all the students in the study who had money, who had full lunches or partial lunch. We just looked at free lunch students. We just looked at students who had money. We looked at students who had money. We stripped out all of the out-of-state moves. We only looked at kids who moved around inside Cheyenne. What we found was astounding. The percentage of students proficient drops almost exponentially based on every move. So, for example, the one that comes to my mind is at the 5th grade level, I think it was, on our pause testing, something like 85 or something % of the students were proficient in reading if they'd stayed in the same elementary, K through 5. If they'd moved once, it dropped. If they'd moved to another school twice, it dropped. Those who had moved 4 times within the system, and they had money, so it's not a poverty issue, the rent's due, I'm out of money, I'm moving. This was students who supposedly had money to pay. It was down to 45% proficiency. Now, in your large districts, what do? The school facilities department sees an open seat across town, and so if this school's full, we ship you to another school. And so the smaller districts have more stability. They don't have the demographic issues. We had 100 Somalian students show up in 1 year, out of the blue. We didn't have one Somalian student. The next year we have 100. How do you think they're going to do on pause? The girls, many of them had never been in school their entire lives. And what happened is they found out that the federal housing issues here in Cheyenne were, the wait list was only 1 year, in Denver or wherever it was 10 years or something. So they shipped up the border and moved here. We're welcome. We're glad to have them. But it started a whole bunch of cultural issues over, prayer rugs and Muslim, issues and all kinds of religious things that came in. So those are what your larger districts are facing that create kind of a more complex environment to teach in that makes the proficiency levels sometimes skewed.
Next question. Could we get your name and your question?
Thank you, and thank the panel. My name is Larry Wolf. I'm a practicing lawyer in Cheyenne. I'm also heavily involved in Mike Sabias's campaign for Superintendent of Public Instruction, which has forced me to learn a lot about education over the last 6 months. I'm not here to inject politics into this, although I'm happy to talk about it later to anybody. But I have two questions if you have time, Aaron. The first one is I'd like the panel's reaction to the use of the ACT as an assessment tool, since it's basically required now of all our students at the junior level. And the second one is that all the books I've been reading talk about how important the quality of the educators is. And we've heard recent criticism of the College of Education, and I'd like to, if you have time, to have the panel speak to that issue. Thank you.
Yeah, who'd like to take the ACT assessment?
I'd love to take the ACT. So it's an interesting world that we live in at the secondary school because, well, as we're talking about the controversy of the two different assessments coming on board, we're giving the ACT. South High School was the only school in the state last year that field tested the Smarter Balanced math test. So I saw it. But are my students ever going to give it? Have it? Are they ever going to take it? I don't know, because right now the legislature has said the ACT. But this is what I can tell you: when test day comes around, I have whatever it is, 24 juniors walk in that room, and they know that test matters. They get it. They understand the importance of the ACT. Back up a couple years ago, where I had juniors walking into the pause. And I smiled, and I told them how important it was. So I love having the ACT as that. I do, because it matters to those students. Is there a whole nother bunch of issues associated with that? Oh, heavens, yes, absolutely. But the practicality of it is it matters for those students. And the buy-in, we don't have to work on buy-in. So that's just my very personal experience with it.
I did a study on the ACT at Laramie 1, and Dr. Moore and I broke it down and took a look at one of the things. I know there was a recent editorial saying it doesn't matter that all our students take it, that's baloney, blah, blah. Well, here's the reality. What we did was we looked at our composite scores of the top 10% of our students from 7 years ago. How did our best 10% do? What we did was when we compared their ACT composite to the next 10%, or to the next 7 years later, the top 10%. It was improved over the previous. Then we looked at the next 10%. It was better. The next 10%, it was better. The next 10%. We went all the way down to the bottom. And when you put all the total together, our total composite was lower. But every subgroup was better till you hit the bottom. Why is that? Kids who weren't planning to go to college didn't take the ACT 7-8 years ago. Now they're required to. They pull down the scores of all those other subgroups. And Simpson's paradox is the term for it. It happens in SAT too, that the sum of the whole is actually lower than all of the improvement of the parts. And basically that's been going on with ethnicity in this country. Our subgroups are improving, but the overall complexion of our country has changed. And therefore the composite is lower. And so we're not failing students in ACT right now. It's just that we have a lot. Actually, we looked at SAT. Do you know that Wyoming is like 8th in the country?
Nobody takes it.
We're near the top on this. Why? Only 5% of the students take the SAT, and they're headed to Harvard. Okay? So, but we're up there, baby. And guess what? Massachusetts is always touted as being one of the top ACT scoring. Guess what? What is 40% of them take it or something? It's not anywhere near what we have. So,
Would someone like to tackle the teacher quality question that was asked?
I'll let Kathy do that. I can tell you what we do when they're not qualified.
Remember, he works here at the University of Wyoming. And personally, I did not graduate from the University of Wyoming. I came from Minnesota, so I came through a different system. And I don't have any opinion on, the University of Wyoming, but my opinion is we need to make sure we raise that bar so that the people going into education are our top students. We need to somehow turn this around because we want the best and the brightest going into education because they're the ones who are going to be teaching our future generations. So I think it's kind of a concept. We need to promote education as a career for our best and brightest students. And I think that's a cultural issue that we need to address because I want my granddaughter taught by somebody who is at the top of their class in elementary, in high school, and in college. And that, I think, is an issue.
Let's get in one more, if you don't mind, just one more. We have time for one more question, so let's make it happen. Here in the back of the room.
Is this on?
And we have just a couple of minutes. So.
My name is Marguerite Herman, and I know everyone up there just about. My kids went through K through 12 in Laramie 1, and as a matter of fact, I'm a candidate for school board there right now. But just addressing the issue of teacher quality is, I remember when the legislature got the idea of accountability for teachers, and this whole idea is to drive improved achievement of students is the teacher. So their first pass at it was, I know, we'll make them all at-will employees and scared to death. And then finally they were talked out of that paradigm because it just didn't make any sense. So now they're on this long, arduous trail that Amy referred to for accountability. And we've all talked about the hazards of tying teacher evaluations and maybe merit pay and other things to test scores. I will have to give credit to the legislators. They have a really good consultant who is telling them, do not tie teacher evaluations to test scores for all the various reasons you've already mentioned up there, because there's so many things that go into that. And so they are not doing that right now. And I would say that we all need to watch that accountability legislation, the Joint Education Committee working on it to make sure they don't go down that path. They do listen to parents, they do listen to educators, and if they start doing that, which is easy, I mean, then you come up with a number and it's easy and you can, stamp the teacher with a letter grade and move on. So what they're working on now is a very elaborate evaluation system that has to do with administrators getting into the room, evaluation and objective measurement tool. It's very difficult, but I think there's merit to it.
Sorry, Matt, could you please get to the question? Sorry.
Well, I guess, if there's anyone wants to comment on how to evaluate a teacher so that ones that do need to be improved, mentored, maybe counseled into another vocation that happened, how do we get teachers to all be excellent?
Jane Wingate?
I think that the short answer to that is evaluation should be about growth. Everybody has the potential to grow. I learn all the time. I get better every day. And that's the focus. It's not on that evaluation because what if I get a C? Okay, so what? It's always about getting better. And that's what the focus, to me, should always be on. And I'm fortunate to work in a district that is exactly what it is. It's always about providing all the opportunities to improve no matter where you are in your career.
Just quickly, Marguerite. What I would say is, as a recovering accountability proponent, because I was in the legislature and I did vote for some of these things, and I will say that I have had a complete turnaround, and I'm weary of it period. I think teacher quality, and because I work in a think tank, I get to dream and think big things. Finland has been brought up as an example. I think this country and this state needs to take a look at the teaching profession and really look at countries like Finland, who treat their, first of all, to get into a Finnish school of education is like getting into med school in the United States. It is very difficult. But when you are in there, you are a rock star, and you are paid like a rock star, and you are treated like a professional. That is the only course. That is the course we should dream. That's the course we should pursue. That's the course we should have. This whole assessment, I'm over it. I don't even want to discuss how to do it. Let's just not do it.
All right. That's all the time. That's all the time we have for Q&A, but I'd encourage you guys to, if you guys can stick around a little bit, if anybody in the audience has some questions, the panelists might be, I don't know their schedules, but might be milling around, so I'd encourage you guys to talk to them. But thank you all in the audience for joining us tonight. Tonight's program, Getting to the Core of Common Core, was a co-production of Wyoming Public Media and Wyoming PBS. It's part of American Graduate, Let's Make It Happen, a public media initiative to address the dropout crisis, supported by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. You can find video online at wyomingpbs.org. Thank you and good night.